A few weeks ago, Rabbi Jack Moline, Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance, was with us. We discussed what he hoped we would and would not hear from Pope Francis during his unprecedented address to a joint session of Congress. Well, that address happened on Thursday morning of this past week, and I'm very happy to have Jack back with us once again to analyze what we heard, as well as some other pressing issues at the intersection of religion, government, and politics. Jack, thanks for being here again.
Thanks for having me again, Welton. It's always a pleasure.
I can just imagine what Washington must have been like this week. I guess nobody complained about road closings.
Well, I have to say that I was in synagogue on the day that the Pope arrived in town and made his tours, and I've never been so glad to be able to walk where I was going.
I bet. Well, let's get there. I mean, we have anticipated this speech, and now we've heard what went on. So Pope Francis tackled the whole question of global climate change right away during the White House ceremony, and then took time to express his deep concern regarding religious liberty. What caught your ear during the Capitol Hill address?
Well, I like a lot of people, I'm reflecting on his discussion of families and what constitutes families. I think he threaded a needle very carefully in terms of choosing his words, but I still maintain a certain amount of concern that he was attempting to advance an image of family that does not include some of the more profound and welcome changes that we've had in America over the course of the last summer, including the affirmation that marriage equality produces family equality, and that we have to continue to advocate for those values within American society. What Roman Catholics believe and other religious groups believe about the nature of family is, of course, up to them and protected by the Constitution. But what Americans do is also protected by the Constitution and not affected by what any particular religious group believes.
Yeah. So do you think he approached it in a way that gave a little bit of comfort to the diversity that was in the room, or did he come down, in your opinion, on one side harder than another? Well,
I have a view of this that is both from high up in the air and very close to the ground. Mm-hmm. I think if you look at the entirety of his speech, and particularly his emphasis on the work of Dr. King and Dorothy Day, and on the contemplative approach that he emphasized with Thomas Merton, I think it's fair to defend that the Pope was defending a broad range of perspectives on society, mm-hmm. and I don't want to follow the lead of a lot of our more right-wing analysts who are trying to drill down into what he was saying mm-hmm. to justify the case against gay marriage. I think very much in keeping with his personality, he left open lots of possibilities without shying away from his own convictions.
Yeah. Oh, that's well said. What'd you think about him dealing with fundamentalism?
Look, I think if there was anything that delighted and surprised me in his speech, it was that call for an understanding that, in my words, religion serves humanity rather than the other way around. And I think we have a lot to look forward to, with a sense of openness emanating from the Holy See as a result of his representations here.
Yeah. Did he talk about climate change as much as you thought he would?
He did not emphasize it quite as much, but I thought he framed it magnificently mm-hmm. As a responsibility that we have to future generations. And he also went into some very dangerous territories in a conservative-dominated legislative chamber when he talked about capitalism. Mm-hmm. And frankly, The two things go together, the exploitation of resources being something that he cautioned against, not just because it is something that disadvantages the poor, but because the notion that we can exploit whatever is at hand is dangerous for the home we live in. Mm-hmm. So I thought it was very elegant and very eloquent, but of course the devil is always in the details. So the nice response that he got from those who were listening will now have to be considered outside the religious context of his representation as a matter of legislation and policy.
You know, you and I, Jack, talked about our shared concern that a faith leader, no matter how prominent, needs to avoid any attempt at dictating U.S. government policy. Did the Pope come off as being a pastor or as a politician?
Oh dear. So his approach was definitely pastoral, Welton. Uh-huh. But I'm willing to take Speaker Boehner at his word that he invited the Pope as a world leader and as the head of the nation of the Vatican, and not as the Holy Father of the Roman Catholic Church. Yeah. So I think that his gentle approach to policy meant that most people who were there listening to him with their legislative ears on rather than their church ears on heard a very good articulation of policy positions he hoped that Congress would embrace, but presented in a way that was far less confrontational than other world leaders who've addressed Congress. Mm-hmm.
Well, and one reason I wanted to revisit that is I actually was surprised at listening to some of the people traveling with the Pope who obviously had been briefed on what they should say about why the Pope was here and what he would be doing. And the ones that I heard were very upfront in saying he is the head of a government as well as being a pastor for everybody that wants him across the world. And yes, he needs to speak as a politician as well as being a pastoral leader. I was surprised by that.
Well, I hate to hand anything to Bill O'Reilly, Welton, but you will recall that I was deployed on behalf of Interfaith Alliance years ago when Pope John Paul II died, and flags were lowered to half-staff in this country, and we had some problems with that. And Mr. O'Reilly said to me on his television program that he found my objection to be illegitimate because the Pope was the head of state. He had a Secretary of State and a full complement of diplomats, and that this was not lowering the flag in honor of a religious leader. Maybe I have to agree with him all these years later.
Well, you know what? I mean, whatever anybody thinks about what you just said, I think historically that's the first time anybody ever complimented O'Reilly on the show. Well, talking about critics, Paul Gosar, a Republican member of Congress who's also a Roman Catholic, skipped the event over the Pope's focus on climate change. You have any thoughts about that?
I really don't have any thoughts about that. I think that if anything illustrates the Pope's emphasis on Thomas Merton's openness to dialogue, it is that we had most of the members of Congress and most of the members of government who were there to hear someone they knew they would not agree with on everything. And I think anybody who closes his or her mind to hearing dissent is not acting within the best values of the United States of America. We have a two-party system because we presume that there's going to be more than one policy position on the matters that affect American lives. And we have elections so that people have a choice, and they can indicate what they agree with and what they disagree with. Anybody who absents himself from a speech because they don't want to hear what's going to be said, I think is making a huge mistake and can't very well represent diverse positions within his or her own constituency. Mm-hmm. I think that's different than saying, I don't think it's appropriate for a particular individual to address Congress, or I don't like the way someone was invited. I know we had this controversy the last time Speaker Boehner invited somebody to address Congress. But to say, I know what he's going to say and I don't want to hear it, I have a problem with that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, neither one of us is Catholic, and I don't know what you've been thinking watching the really hyper actions that some people have seemed to demonstrate over the fact that he is in Washington and was speaking to Congress and to other audiences. I thought the media was really more enthusiastic in some ways than I've ever heard them be about the fact that a religious leader is in town, and I think they saw him as a religious leader, not so much as a politician. Well, I'm curious both what you thought and what you've heard from your friends and allies who are Catholics about what this visit from the Pope means.
So one of the hallmarks of your tenure as president of Interfaith Alliance was your rightful emphasis on the potential for religion to have healing power in our society. And if I'm going to applaud the Pope's visit here as a religious leader, it is that it has been recognized, and especially in the media, that somebody of his demeanor, even though he is deeply devoted to values that some people will agree with and some people will completely disagree with, but his demeanor allows for religion to have that healing power, to invite people in, to address matters of concern in a way that is positive and effective. And so I'm fine with the media's attention to him as a religious leader, because in the end, we sometimes forget this, but even though the media can shape perception, in the end, the way he behaves is the way he should be judged, and he's behaved himself in a manner that is appropriate for a head of state, I would think. He's got other responsibilities, and those are not state occasions, and so I'm okay with that. In terms of what I've heard from people in my community, I think probably the biggest manufactured story of this visit was his activities yesterday during Yom Kippur. I received so many press inquiries from people wanting to know if Jews were offended that he was coming on Yom Kippur. And nobody that I spoke with in the Jewish community was offended. It was only people wanting to know if we were offended who made this a story.
Yeah.
He came on a state visit. He came to minister to his flock in the time he wasn't interacting with government. And he didn't want a seat in synagogue, which meant nobody had to give up a place for him. So what possible objection could we have?
Yeah. Well, Jack, let me just say up front before I move to the next question that I have covered only a half of what I wanted to cover on this interview, and the time is up. So I want to just say to you right now that we need you to come back really soon, because the Interfaith Alliance has once again rolled out the 5 questions that need to be posed to political candidates. I want us to talk about that, but we can't do it today. There's one thing we have to talk about, though, and that is, though all eyes seem to have been on the Pope this week, there's been another news story that has to be addressed. Ben Carson, who's making a strong run for the Republican presidential nomination, was on Meet the Press last week. I want our listeners first to hear what he said.
Should a president's faith matter? Should your faith matter to voters?
Well, I guess it depends on what that faith is. If it's inconsistent with the values and principles of America, then of course it should matter. But if it fits within the realm of America and consistent with the Constitution, no problem.
So do you believe that Islam is consistent with the Constitution?
No, I don't. I do not. I would not advocate that we put a Muslim in charge of this nation. I absolutely would not agree with that.
Jack, that got some mainstream criticism, but at the same time, Family Research Council President Tony Perkins came out in strong support. I know you didn't support that. I want to know what you thought.
So thank you for asking that question, Welton. I indeed have been spending the time that I haven't been asked about the Pope, I've been asked about Ben Carson, which is an interesting juxtaposition. This is only the most recent example of what I'm calling the politics of otherness that has infected candidates in all sorts of races, but most especially in the race for president. We've had people condemning gays and lesbians. We've had people condemning people of Mexican origin, whether they're here legally or not. We've had people condemning the poor, and we've had people condemning the rich. It is almost as if the path to the White House is paved with making one group of people feel that they're better than somebody else in the United States. And that's, I think, what Dr. Carson has done. It is reprehensible for him to speak that way of American citizens who are members of the Muslim faith community, just as it's reprehensible for any candidate to designate any class of Americans as being less than equal. I'm very distressed when we have anyone pointing at a minority and saying they're only 4/5 a citizen of the United States. That bothers me tremendously.
Absolutely, and we really do have to talk more about that and some other things that are going on in the election. That's all the time we've got, though, for today. Rabbi Jack Moline has served as a congregational rabbi for over 30 years, most recently at the Agudas Achim congregation in Alexandria, Virginia. Having held a number of leadership positions for numerous Jewish interfaith and community organizations, today, thank God, Jack is Executive Director at Interfaith Alliance. Jack, as always, let me thank you for being with us on State of Belief Radio, but more than that, let me thank you for the large influence that you are exerting in a nation that badly needs you and Interfaith Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you, Welton, and let me encourage your listeners to help us continue that effort by supporting State of Belief Radio and by supporting Interfaith Alliance.